Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, January 30th, 2024, and last night Politico came out with an article talking about the Democratic Party and their priorities for the 2024 Senate races, as Democrats make early ad reservations in key Senate races to lock in on some of the early rates in TV ad spending. Now, this comes as news as the Biden campaign is expected to spend a historic amount of money on an upcoming ad blitz across the country. The Democratic Party has been very open about spending a lot of money on advertisements because this is the way that has worked for them over the past few elections. And looking at this new article from Politico, I can't help but to think this sort of reveals exactly what the Democratic Party's strategy is very early on and what states they really are honing in on. In this article, they discuss directly the Montana and Nevada Senate races, but also recognize the very competitive nature of many other Senate races across the country. Now, with Democrats making a huge ad spend in Montana and Nevada, Republicans are responding not only proportionately, but in some cases doubling the amount of money that Democrats are slated to spend in these races. But context is always important. This 2024 Senate map is far from conducive to a Democratic Party victory. The Democrats, after their last Senate elections, came in with a 51-49 advantage over the GOP, but it's far from strong. What we're working with here is Democrats having to defend a significant amount of territory after already giving up the state of West Virginia, which in the last time this Senate map was up, went to the Democrats by a margin of around 3 points. Now, we all know Joe Manchin, but if you don't, Joe Manchin previously served as the governor, ran for the United States Senate in West Virginia, and had his narrowest election in 2018. West Virginia also just so happens to be a state that voted for President Trump in the last election by nearly 40 points over President Biden. And so when you see that and put that all into context, West Virginia very much becomes a state that is far out of reach for the Democratic Party, even with a candidate like Joe Manchin. And thus, Joe Manchin chose to retire, giving the seat entirely up to the Republicans. And so West Virginia already, as an immediate flip to the GOP, means that they have 49 safe and secure seats. We can argue for days about Florida, but realistically, in my opinion, it simply isn't going to flip. So that narrows down to just Texas as the sole battleground state for the GOP that they are defending. Democrats, on the other hand, are defending 7 out of the 8. And so when I look at that, I really understand that this is not going to be a real horse race, right? This should be an easy Republican pickup, especially if they are winning control of the presidency, because we remember back in 2020 what that Senate map looked like when it was 50-50 with Democrats in the advantage because of Vice President Harris. But looking at this map here, again, you're working with 7 out of the 8 being competitive races on the Democratic side. And Democrats, of course, are playing defense rather than offense in this election year. With these early ad reservations of tens of millions of dollars across Montana and Nevada at this early stage means the Democrats are extremely worried about these two states. For one, I think Montana has always made a lot of sense. It's a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by a margin of around 16 points, and arguably Jon Tester didn't have a phenomenal showing when it came down to this election result. But Jon Tester actually has done better than he did in previous elections. And so 2018, for all that it was worth for the Democratic Party, Jon Tester actually did better than some other races that might have been otherwise deemed as better for the Democratic Party on the presidential level, like 2012 when he was also on the ballot. But what I see here too is that Jon Tester faced off against a very pesky Republican opponent here, Matt Rosendale, who has been the subject of a lot of criticism from the mainstream GOP now because he wants to run again against Jon Tester in this upcoming election. You might be wondering, why didn't he run in the other election? Well, that brings me to my second point. Back in 2020, Montana had its Senate election, but there was already an incumbent. Matt Rosendale had been elected or was running to serve in the House of Representatives, and so he decided that he was going to go for somewhat of a lower office, represent the entire state, rather than run for Senate. But Steve Daines here was the incumbent, and he defeated a Democratic opponent by a margin of around 10 points. And so you might be thinking, okay, if Trump won it by 16, but Steve Daines won by 10, what does that mean on the Senate side? Are they just more prone to electing Democrats? Partially, but a lot of it has to do with candidate quality. Steve Bullock, the Democratic nominee here, was the incumbent Democratic governor who ran on the same ballot as Donald Trump in 2016 and won his election. Rather than run again, I believe he was term limited, he opted to go for United States Senate, but not after a short-lived presidential bid. But I don't think that was really the determining factor here. Rather than be elected on a statewide level where your policy would just impact the state as a whole, it came down to national numbers. The voters in Montana inherently are right-wing and do want Republican representation in the United States Senate. And so when they voted against Steve Bullock by 10 points, it was a very big warning sign to Jon Tester because he was going to be running alongside a very similar margin that Donald Trump won by in 2020, again in 2024. And so the one benefit of Jon Tester in 2018 was the fact that he was able to win in a blue wave year. There was no presidential ballot and he was the top of the ticket, and that mattered a lot. It helped Democrats in down ballot races in Montana, but when you flip it in 2020, you start to see exactly how there is a direct impact of a top ticket candidate, in this case would be Donald Trump again, and the benefits of that. Down individual ballots. And so looking at the 2024 race, Montana makes a lot of sense to lock in so early in this race, not to mention that Jon Tester is the Democratic nominee. He won't be facing a competitive primary, and he's not a nobody to this state. He was first elected in 2006, and he has a lot to defend. He's aligned himself with President Biden quite heavily, quite extensively, and when you take a look across the country, a lot of Democrats who do that tend to not be super popular amongst their constituencies if it's a swing state, not to mention a red state. But Jon Tester, surprisingly enough, has been able to really push beyond that, do a lot better than I think those were expecting in many of his elections, including 2018. And I think he will do a lot better than people expect in 2024. But you have to equally recognize that at this point in time, the 2024 Senate race that's happening in Montana is not the only competitive Senate race for the Democratic Party. They have a lot that they need to defend. Like I just showed you, 7 out of the 8 races on this map here that are competitive are simply just Democratic states that were solid in 2018 or somewhat strong for Democrats in 2018, but are starting to waver down as President Biden becomes more unpopular and the reality sets in that Republicans realistically could win back control of the U.S. Senate. And so we shift over and shift gears to the state of Nevada, where you have Jackie Rosen, an incumbent Democratic senator, first elected back in, guess what, 2018, who's running for re-election. Now, Jackie Rosen, I think, is a stronger candidate than also people expect. I think this early ad buy in Nevada, like it was suggested in this article or directly mentioned, not suggested, was for early ad reservations. So that way you can lock in on an early rate when you're spending this amount of money in these battleground states. But in Nevada specifically, Jackie Rosen actually defeated a Republican incumbent back in 2018. Now, there is one side of it to say, the Republicans were never going to win this race. It was a Democratic wave year. Hillary Clinton had held out this state against Donald Trump. But on the flip side, think about it where we're coming from with Dean Heller. He won on the same ballot that Barack Obama won by in 2012. There was a significant amount of crossover support between 2012 in the Senate race and the presidential race. But in 2018, that crossover support really didn't exist. Dean Heller, despite being someone who's viewed as more moderate, now described often as a rhino, came in third place in the GOP governor primary here because he was pretty much ostracized by the mainstream GOP in the state of Nevada to go from senator all the way down to third place candidate in the governor's race there, with no endorsements. It's really, I would say, arguably a sad way to fizzle out of Nevada politics. But Jackie Rosen defeated him by around 5 points. And I think we look at this and say, maybe it makes sense for the time, but Nevada, despite being a consistently blue state, really doesn't waver with wave years. And in some cases actually votes against the Democratic Party, but never on the presidential margin. I think when you take a look at it a little bit more in depth, it comes to a very, very big realization here that I think Nevada is still very much a close state, but Democrats just luck out. It's very similar to North Carolina on the Republican side, where yes, it is always competitive. But when you look at who it's voted for consistently, it looks a lot more like a safe state than it does a competitive one, just by chance, right? And so when you look at Nevada in 2018, Rosen won it by 5. 2016, Catherine Cortez Masto went on the same margin here. I mean, identical margin as Hillary Clinton winning by 2.4. When you go back to 2012, Dean Heller won by 1.2. Competitive here, but that was the last time you saw a Republican win a Senate race in the state of Nevada. When you take a look at 2010, despite it being a phenomenal year for Republicans, there were 9 seats picked up in the U.S. Senate here. When you take a look at Illinois, Barack Obama's home state, that's a state that Biden won by 20 in the last election. So you're looking at states like this going red, and Nevada is still 5.7. Even when you take a look at California, a state that is solid Republican, Carly Fiorina, you might remember her from 2016, this was a race that was decided by 10 points. And so when you look at the perspective here Nevada actually came in to be one of the larger states in favor of the Democratic Party, and believe it or not, this is the same, map that we were working with in 2016 and also in the last election cycle when we covered this election. So times certainly have changed since then. You can see the map here now. Pennsylvania's blue, Georgia's blue, Arizona's blue, right? A bunch of these states across the country are blue, New Hampshire as well. But it's really interesting because when you put it into perspective here, you start to see the Democrats also had a prime opportunity in 16, prime opportunity in 22, an opportunity they simply do not have in this election cycle. And so now with these early targets, you also have to dive a little bit deeper into this article to start to see where they are going to be focusing their money. And I think it's pretty obvious, but it makes a lot of sense why it's being explicitly mentioned. Because Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are also, as mentioned, 3 states that will determine the presidential race. Arizona will be another battleground. Many of these states will be a battleground. Nevada and Montana, Nevada way more than Montana, but largely we can predict how they are going to go. Nevada did shock a few Democrats by voting for Joe Lombardo for governor, but there is a Democratic supermajority in the state legislature, and there wasn't as much invested in that race because arguably Democrats had a lot less to lose than if Catherine Cortez Masto had lost. And CCM, she ended up winning in that race, right, against her Republican opponent, and so it shows that it's still on the national level, Republicans don't exactly do so well in the state of Nevada. Montana, on the other hand, Republicans do phenomenal, but that makes sense. Montana is a state that has always consistently voted in favor of the GOP. The last time it went blue, I believe, was in 96 or 92 under President Clinton, and since then has been a GOP lock. But it means here that it will be a state of unique importance for Democrats, because unlike all of the other states on this battleground map, from Nevada to Ohio to Texas to Pennsylvania, they aren't competitive. Montana is not competitive on the presidential ballot, which means every single rally that Joe Biden does across these other states could be benefiting the Democratic Party, could be benefiting Jackie Rosen depending on Biden's rebound in approval, could be benefiting Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, could be defending Elise, whoever it might be actually in Michigan, because we'll talk about that primary a little bit later on, but it looks like we know who it's going to go. Ohio here, right? You could see this benefiting Sherrod Brown. You could see it benefiting Bob Casey, even Colin Allred in Texas, even though there's a competitive primary there as well, which we will talk on again in a future video. President Biden won't touch Montana. And maybe if he does once or twice, it would only really be in the final stretch to hone in a core base, but it honestly might turn off more voters than it attracts to the Jon Tester campaign. Tester has been very much resilient because he has distanced himself from national Democrats, including presidents like Obama and including President Biden. He has benefited from the fact that he has made himself to be an independent figure, well-respected and liked in Montana, rather than someone who falls in party line and votes alongside the party metrics that we have seen. Many of the Democrats do. And though he does do that, he positions himself in a way that he does not present that way. He comes across as way more moderate than he actually is. When you look at his voting record and you look at the actual internal politics of the Democratic Party, Jon Tester is a reliable vote, and you almost never have to court him to vote on the side of the left. But when you look at it, when he goes back to Montana and the way he campaigns, positions himself, his ads that he's spending, the constituent services that he does, everything has been about a consistent re-election bid. And arguably it has been working. I'm interested to see, though, where we start to see more money pour in to some of these races. One in particular that I think we could see start to become a target for Democrats, the only state they can really play on the offense here is the state of Texas, where you have Ted Cruz, who is quite plainly put, an unlikable senator and an unlikable guy. That's what the metrics show. That's what everything shows. And I think that is a really, really important factor here, because Texas, if it was Greg Abbott on the Senate ballot, wouldn't even be in consideration. So the only real reason that Texas is even in this competitive races column is because of Senator Ted Cruz, who has made it his intention to run for re-election. And honestly speaking, I think he's gearing up for a 2028 presidential bid. But that's so far out in the future. Let's talk about Texas really quickly, because I think it deserves some importance. If the Democratic Party wants to seriously play on the offense here, they have to target this state. For as much as the Republican media, Fox News, whatever it might be, builds up this idea that Texas is untouchable for the Democratic Party, that is just observably false. In 2018, Ted Cruz won his race with 50.9% of the vote. Beto O'Rourke got 48.3%. A margin of 2.6% doesn't exactly inspire confidence in anyone, left or right, on the Republican Party's ability to consistently win in this state. When President Trump had the narrowest victory in Texas out of any Republican in the past 40 years, that also is something that really comes into question. Does he have the ability to win this state in 2024? My answer is yes. I think President Trump wins it, but I think it will be close. A lot closer, arguably, than some people currently are predicting. And I think that's because right now the state of the country is in favor of Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to the Senate race in Texas, when it comes down to many of these other Senate races, we generally know how they're going to go. But for many of them, too, they are quite competitive, and these early ad buys and these early ad reservations are revealing exactly where Democrats are extremely worried, what they need to focus on, and where they might be playing into the offensive side. Texas will be close. We will see if Democrats start allocating extensive amounts of spending there. Colin Allred, I think, recently raised $7 million in the past quarter, so that's good news for Democrats there, but it's a big state. It's going to require a lot of money. Montana, Nevada together are getting over $30 million in this early ad reservation. Republicans are responding by doubling that in some of these states. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this ad spending and ad reservation really breaks down, because it reveals the inherent strategy here for both sides of the aisle, and it's fascinating to take a look at from the outside. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.